Egyptian ties were very strong in Israel at this time. And John's witness has shown how Lehi was a metalworker, and he passed on that metalworking information onto Nephi. Now, when they went down south into the wilderness, the kids came back to Jerusalem several different times. One for the brass plates, one for the Ishmael and his family, so that the kids could get married and have kids and have families. The mines of Timnah are in between that region where they were staying in the wilderness and in Jerusalem. And I've shown that in the Lehi Arabian Odyssey videos that I've produced, so I won't go into that. So the idea that he was a metalworker is very prominent in the Book of Mormon. There's lots of clues, I should put it that way. Well, Lehi's great-grandparents and grandparents, this is Gardner on page 80, would have had to figure out a way to support themselves without any land to farm once the Assyrians came and wiped things out. Something they could do from living inside the city wall that Hezekiah had built between 705 and 701 BC. As first pointed out by John Twetness, indication in the writings of Nephi suggests that both Nephi and his father Lehi were professional metalsmiths. And this vocation would have been ideal for Lehi's ancestors to learn, since it would have not required any ownership or any rental property outside the city. Like most professionals of that age, Nephi would have apprenticed with and learned from metalworker's trade from his father. Lehi had likely learned it from his father, who in turn had learned it in order to survive as a landless resident of Jerusalem's Mishnah. Now that's interesting. Because from the north, the refugees from the northern area flowed down into Judah after the Assyrians destroyed them. So we know Lehi, being from Manasseh, is in the north. And the Book of Mormon reflects an internal consistency of being of the northern tribes rather than from Judah. It's very interesting how Nephi mentions the Jews several times. He says, I say the Jews because they are they from whom I have come. But there's kind of a coolness toward that. Nibley pointed that out in some of his materials, that Nephi didn't technically identify with the Jews, and of course they're all Israelites, but he was kind of cool toward them stoning the prophets, of course, and threatening his father's life, and so on and so forth. But well, so anyway, he discusses more on the geography, and discusses Jeffrey Chadwick and Potter and Wellington, and I've done all this already, and S. Kemp Brown. He came to the borders of the Red Sea, and he pitched his tent, and then he comes across the river of Laman and the valley of Lemuel, and he exhorts his kids to righteousness and faithfulness. And there is some discussion still back and forth between what is found here, and then he talks a little bit about the printer's manuscript, which is kind of an interesting situation. But now, and I've actually mentioned this in another one of my videos too, but it's worth a recap, because after Nephi and his brothers get back to camp from getting the brass plates, Lehi offers sacrifice on an altar of stones, and they had to be unhewn stones. And this idea of, well, the Semitic custom of naming the river for Laman and naming bodies of water and land features, geographical sites and all that. Of course, the names through time are forgotten, but each individual tribe did that. And the family's safe arrival occasioned a ritual offering for a safe journey, according to Psalm 107. And S. Kemp Brown, another very excellent Book of Mormon scholar, has pointed this out. He says, for a safe journey, according to Psalm 107, a person was to sacrifice the sacrifices of thanksgiving. That's Psalm 107:22. For safety in travel, whether through the desert or on the water. Well, what were those sacrifices of thanksgiving? They consisted of peace offerings, known from Leviticus chapter 3, of course. The sacrifice itself was an animal, either male or female, from the flock of the herd, and it was accompanied by unleavened baked goods, forming part of a covenant meal, which the worshippers enjoyed fellowship with one another and their God. Peace offerings were the most common type of sacrifice. Truly, such occasions were to be a time of rejoicing. So in this light, one has to assume either that among the provisions moved by Lehi's family from Jerusalem, they probably had animals. Realistically, they would take those with them, intended for sacrifice as well as for food, of course. And they, according to Leviticus, the resulting food for the feast included the sacrificed animal were to be eaten the same day that they were offered, so that nothing of the sacrifice remained to the following morning. That's Leviticus 7:15. Thus the banquet and celebrating would continue into the night. And this is what we find in just a very terse comment, but it is there in the Book of Mormon when the kids came back. Well, Yahweh called Lehi to a prophetic mission, then directed him to take off. Take a hike, go out into the wilderness. He erected an altar, and he thanked Yahweh for his deliverance. The record does not include any actual attacks. The typical Arab Hebrew altar was built of earth or unhewn stones. Possibly a few other building materials were available. Nevertheless, it could have been a pit ringed by stones or a brush pyre. What significance did a stone altar have? Now, this is fun. I love Brandt's idea here. I really like how he puts this into context. Early Israelite worship understood high places to be of particular importance, and it had serious religious significance. Moses received his theophany, of course, on Mount Sinai. Now, this was when Moses was up into the top of Mount Sinai. And, of course, he had further revelations once he got back down to the base camp to the Israelites. But on top, on the high place, in the high place, is where God met him. And as we get into the Book of Mormon, we'll see time and again how Nephi is being commanded to always go up into a mountain, especially when he builds his ship. And he went into an exceeding high mountain to have his vision of the tree of life, and so on and so forth. So this idea of high places, the mountains anciently were considered temples of God. So this is kind of interesting. So an altar is basically a miniature high place. That's why it had to be unhewn, because no mountains are hewn. They're just natural constructs built by earthquakes and through the pressure of geological processes. So an altar symbolized a miniature mountain, a miniature high place that they could have access to so that they could offer their sacrifice. And I thought, well, that's kind of a fun little insight. That's very interesting how Lehi falls right in line with the symbolism by building an altar of stones. And notice the Hebraism. This is not a stone altar. It is an altar of stones. It's in the construct. That's a very beautiful Hebrew usage, just so you're aware of that. So anyway, creating a symbolic miniature sacred mountain appropriate for the sacrificial offering. This is Gardner in Volume 1 on page 85, by the way, on this idea of the high places. And the fact that after the Israelite possession of the land, altars and sacrifices and even other temples continued at various places has led many scholars to believe that the laws of Deuteronomy 12 were either understood differently before the time of the reform of Hezekiah and Josiah, or they were written or enforced later, perhaps during the reigns of Hezekiah, Manasseh, and Josiah. The second reason for this altar, this idea of the high places, is particularly interesting in light of the Book of Mormon text. While it is clear that Josiah interpreted the injunction of centralized worship to refer only to Jerusalem, this was Josiah's view, it is possible that anciently there was another very viable interpretation of this text. And this is what I made a video of on the temple being built outside of Jerusalem. And they had to, the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Temple Scrolls shows how the priests had to be at least 3 days' distance from the temple in Jerusalem before they could offer sacrifices. And David Rolfe Seeley has noted this, that the Dead Sea Scrolls provide evidence for the sacrifice, the possibility of sacrifice, once you are 3 days beyond the temple in Jerusalem. And that is precisely how the Book of Mormon record puts it. Once they traveled for 3 days into the wilderness, then Lehi stopped and offered sacrifice. So we kind of have a nifty tie-in with the Dead Sea Scrolls in that theme. I thought that was kind of fun. So anyway, Qumran became a new Jerusalem to its inhabitants. I'm on page 86 now of Gardner. I'm quickly going through because I've got a couple of the other things, well, that I want to get to, but no, we know the Qumran community went out into the wilderness. A beautiful Book of Mormon theme. I mean, Lehi did it, and Nephi does it later, and then Alma does it, and then Limhi does it. I mean, Mosiah did it, if you'll recall the record. the righteous are constantly called out of the communities of the wicked, because once the communities obey the commandments of the Lord, they prosper. And then, of course, they get arrogant, they get stiff necks and high heads, they get cocky, they wear costly apparels, they love their golden materials more than the Lord and His commandments, and then the righteous are taken away from them.